Maybe let's get started in the interest of time. We had the same issue in our first session. Let's get started with our recaps, and hopefully the rest of the gang will join along the way. So our last revision session, essentially, we've covered, so our process has been, we've looked at a chapter and then we've gone and looked at the questions. We focused on what the approach should be in terms of how we look at the questions, the different types of questions which can come your way. All of these have been our focus in our last 3 sessions. Today's session, the last 2 chapters which we need to be discussing as well, we will use the same approach across. Quick summary and revise of the respective content, and then we will jump into the questions. Right. So we move into the investment management aspect of things. We start off with portfolio construction theory. We looked at modern portfolio theory, where essentially the discussion was how we can reduce the risk in our portfolio through diversification, meaning by introducing incremental securities. But essentially here, and the underlying principle here is don't put all your eggs in one basket. And there were 2 important concepts in this respective section. You had the systematic risk and you had the unsystematic risk component. We recognize what is the systematic and unsystematic risk. The systematic being the market risk, the unsystematic risk being the company specific factor. And understandably, when we looked at our theory sessions, the market risk is applicable to all participants as a whole. So diversifying the same is a lot more challenging, and you're mostly going to be exposed to it virtually entirely. The unsystematic risk component, on the other hand, through diversification, we can reduce this unsystematic risk component. And that's particularly what we are looking at in this context as well, which we illustrated through this diagram. We saw you have the total risk, and as the number of stocks in the portfolio increases, you see your overall risk coming down. And this risk that is coming down is the unsystematic risk component. The systematic or the market risk component remains static. We also want to look at another theoretical aspect in the form of the efficient frontier. We plotted the risk to return a ratio of different portfolios that can prevail in a market. Essentially, all the portfolios on the efficient market, on the curve, on the efficient frontier, all the portfolios on the efficient frontier are efficient. Portfolios which are either above or below the efficient frontier can have inefficiencies, right? That we need to be careful about. Ultimately, what we are trying to say is, for a given level of risk, the portfolios that prevail on the efficient frontier are the most efficient portfolios that we are talking about. So as you can see, the chart illustrated the possible different portfolios that you can have on an efficient frontier, and graphically represents the portfolios that maximize the return for a specific level of risk. It doesn't mean that along the line, when you select a portfolio, one is better than the other. No, for that given level of risk, that is the respective portfolio that generates the best level of return. And you can see and distinguish between an investor with a low risk tolerance, an investor with a high risk tolerance, and an investor with an in-between risk tolerances as well. We went on to talk about efficient market hypothesis. We spoke about the different forms of the market. We spoke about active management and passive management as well. Active management, where you see a constant level of trading and activity taking place in the portfolio. Transaction costs are going to be relatively higher, and the related return can also be attractive in a similar form. Passive management, on the other hand, is more like buy and hold strategies. You enter into a particular position and you hold the stock across the period of time. We've spoken about the active passive management in our previous discussions as well. You can have volatilities as the markets move up and down because you're holding it for a longer period of time. As the markets fluctuate, your portfolio will also fluctuate. But ultimately, in the longer run, passive management is what we are after. We analyze market efficiency at three levels: a weak form efficient market, a semi-strong form efficient market, and a strong form efficient market. In the weak form, what the prices are reflecting is all past share price data, future prices that are independent of past data, future prices are independent of past data, and you cannot take advantage of technical analysis. Because if you remember in our discussion on technical analysis, our underlying assumptions were what? Historical trends are going to repeat, and you're going to see that same occurring in the future as well. And if all price volume data has been in history, in the history of the share is already reflected in the share price, then that analysis is going to be limited to that text. Semi-strong form market, on the other hand, share prices reflect all the historical information plus all publicly available information as well, which will instantaneously react to any new news coming into the market. Now, this publicly available, this financial information, this qualitative information, for example, what we are talking about is the fundamental information that we can talk about, fundamental analysis. So if you look at a semi-strong form market, which is a build-up from the weak form market, all historical price volume data is reflected. Technical analysis, you can't make any exponential profits. In a semi-strong form market, in addition to not being able to make profits from technical analysis, because all the historical price volume data is already reflected, you cannot make any exponential profits from fundamental analysis as well, because all publicly available information instantaneously has been reflected across in the price as well. No excess return can be earned by trading on that information, and neither fundamental nor technical analysis will help you make exponential profits. Then comes the strong form market. This is where the share price will reflect all available information, including the material non-public. Insider information is also reflected across in the share price. Very difficult to make exponential returns, particularly through active management. Passive management is the approach to give you some return. I would think a popular area where questions can come across, right, which you will do well to revise on. Some of the limitations we discussed when it came to this efficient market hypothesis, we constantly spoke about. When it came to efficient market hypothesis, when it came to capital asset pricing model, etc., we spoke about the limitations because it's important to understand the limitations as well, because it's going to have a bearing on your analysis. Some of these limitations, as you can see, investors are always assumed to be rational. Historical values are used as anchors to make decisions. Not all the participants, the assumption is that all participants absorb and interpret information in the same manner. These are all, in fact, unrealistic assumptions even. But that being said, there are no other recognized or the tools which give a higher explanatory power for the portfolio construction theories. Right? Despite the limitations, which include investors are not always rational, historical values can be used as anchors to make decisions. All market participants will not think in the same way. Depending on your risk tolerance, depending on your risk capacity, the decisions, the way you interpret information will change, which will kind of have implications to the entire efficient market hypothesis aspect, right? It's important that we recognize this, which you can be tested on also. Which brings us to the capital asset pricing model. How we started our discussion on the capital asset pricing model was, if you remember, we compared our decision to making a risk-free investment, such as in a treasury bond, versus investing in an equity share. And we recognized for you to attract an investor to put money into your equity, into your ordinary shares, you will have to offer a risk premium. Right? The required rate of return for the equity investor to put money in your ordinary shares, that is what we calculated using the capital asset pricing model. How did we construct this? the risk-free rate plus a risk premium. How did we build the risk premium here? We take the beta factor, which we consider as the sensitivity of the securities return to that of the market, and we multiply it by the excess return of the market above the risk-free rate. We had a lot more discussion there in terms of why we use that as well. But essentially, you're not going to be, understanding that it is the required rate of return for an equity investor, and how the calculation works. This is probably going to be the most common examination area, which you will see. How and why and the backgrounds of the capital asset pricing model, I don't see appearing to a very technical level, right? Although the limitations you can be examined on, right? Some of the limitations, again, there are some major assumptions that are being made when it comes to the capital asset pricing model. All market participants borrow and lend at the same risk-free rate. They have, all the participants have well-diversified portfolios, and the systematic, unsystematic risk component is completely diversified again. No taxes, no transaction costs, which cause market efficiencies. All investors want to achieve a maximum return to minimum risk ratio, which sometimes is on a baseline, yeah, that is a reasonable assumption, but there are times sentimental, behavioral, etc. factors which can cause that assumption to go haywire. And market participants have the same expectation about returns and standard deviation of all assets, which again is a stretch as an assumption, right? So it's good to be aware of what the assumptions are. You're not going to get questions like, what if you relax the assumption that everybody can borrow and invest at the risk-free rate? How is your capital asset pricing model going to change? Nothing of that sort is going to come your way, right? We also looked at arbitrage pricing theory, which is in response to the capital asset pricing model's main limitation, that it is a single period model, which can affect the securities risk and expected return, right? So rather than relying on a single beta option, for instance, it adopts a more complex multi-factor approach through a regression analysis, right? Essentially what happens is, when you look at your ratio over here, you're seeing one beta factor into the market return, which is happening over here. One beta factor into the risk premiums. But you can have a situation where you might be considering multiple beta factors. So we can call this beta factor 2, etc., beta factor 3, beta factor 4 into the respective market premiums. You can have multiple beta factors to factor in this element across over here, right? Through regression analysis is how we will arrive at that. We also went on to look at behavioral finance, extremely interesting area in terms of portfolio construction, because don't forget, as we discussed, some of the virtually entirely the movement in markets can be explained by technical factors, fundamental factors, and sentimental factors, right? And that sentimental, or that behavioral, the psychological aspects of the markets can be explained by behavioral finance. And we recognized how to distinguish between traditional finance and behavioral finance. Traditional finance explains how a rational investor has to behave, whereas behavioral finance, on the other hand, explains why an investor behaved the way he did, which is a lot more important to us as well. And we looked at many different elements across the key concepts of behavioral finance. We started off with heuristics, rules of thumb, where people will use benchmarks, for example. You can have use of information, where individuals may take into account all relevant information which might explain why past performance is what it is, and fail to take into account risk and expected return. There is inertia, where once people have made decisions, they tend to leave them unchanged. Status quo bias is attached to this element as well. Representativeness, when you're faced with making certain decisions of uncertainty, inadequate information will play a key role, and individuals will tend to start seeing patterns and similarities to previous contexts, or perhaps none would have even been in place, right? This is what causes the, it explains behaviors like herding mentalities or uptrending markets or bubbles or whatever it might be. Overconfidence in your capabilities to forecast or value securities, for example, you're putting more weightage on your predictive ability, which may not entirely be justified, and a consequence out of that. Don't forget, you can have questions which may ask you, this is where the application comes into play. They may ask you the consequences of the respective biases. For example, if you're looking at an overconfidence bias, for instance, your overconfidence about predictive abilities. So what you're going to do is you're going to start trading a lot more because you are unjustifiably overconfident about your decision making, about your analytical criteria, which may not be the case. Anchoring, where investors will use certain reference points which are arbitrarily chosen, and they'll use that to make their decisions. Gambler's fallacy, availability, where the easiest information which is coming to the mind, you're picking and choosing and putting it across in play. We looked at prospect theory in the form of loss aversion, where individuals will play safe when you're talking about gains, but they are going to be reluctant to realize losses. Right? Regrettive distinguished mental accounting and information and noise, and the bias on a behavioral aspect we spoke about. Then we went on to the second section under investment management, which was to do with investment strategies. Now, as I kept mentioning in the theory sessions as well, you saw the sequence of events culminating together. You looked at the markets, you looked at the regulation, we identified the different asset classes, we looked at the implications from collective instruments, we recognized fiduciary responsibilities, and we started thinking about, okay, suitability, how do we look at its objectives, what are the asset classes, how do we match these, etc. We've seen all of those up to this point, including the investment analysis. Then came the investment management. We know the objectives, we've recognized the asset classes. Now we need to structure the overall investment strategy to achieve the respective objective of the investor. Passive investment strategies, you do see the institutional investors, the longer term investors, taking this strategy into play on a much larger basis. Index tracking necessitates, for example, the construction of a portfolio which tracks the performance of a particular index. Passive strategy. You're not actively buying and selling, you're only following a particular index. You can have full replication, you can have stratified sampling and optimization, which we've spoken about. And we've looked at the advantages and disadvantages of the respective strategy as well. We looked at active investment strategy, where you're trying to seek to outperform a particular benchmark over a specific period. Let's say the S&P SL20 or the all share price index. You're trying to outperform it using the respective benchmark. You're trying to outperform it. But don't forget, when you look at a passive approach and you're following an indexing strategy, for example, your active risk, the incremental risk is much lower. Why? You're basically trying to replicate the index return. You will balance, rebalance, etc. the portfolios to almost exactly match the characteristics of the index. There will be some standard error unless full replication is used. But there will generally be some standard error, but the active risk is much lower. Then comes active investment management. Here what happens is you're trying to outperform the index. How do you outperform the index? The proportions of industries you're holding the portfolio versus the benchmark, you will change. The proportion of securities you're holding versus the index are going to change. Right? All these elements, you will start having a divergence from the benchmark portfolio to achieve that active return. But that active return, that incremental return, that outperforming return, remember, higher the return versus the benchmark, what is also going to happen to your risk is also going to increase. Active risk, when it comes to active management, is also going to be high. Right? So the decisions which you will have to make as an active investment strategy where you're looking to outperform a particular benchmark, you will look at asset allocation, you will look at sector allocation, and you will look at stock selection. These are the decisions. These are the variables that you will change to generate that active return, right? And we looked at how we quantify this as well, which we will see in a minute. Bottom-up active management, we define focus solely on the unique attractiveness of the stocks itself. We don't come with, okay, what is the economy, what is the industry, which is the asset class that is going to perform. Within the asset class, what is going to be the sector selection. Under sector selection, what is the stock selection that I'm going to do. You're not going to have that sequence. You're directly going to go into the bottom itself and select, okay, which is the best stock that is going to outperform. No top-down analysis, straight to the bottom, and you're trying to pick the gems, as we like to call it. Economy, industry, market prospects. Thereafter, after identifying the gem, you look at, okay, what is this? This is the value. This is the gem that I have identified from a security perspective. What does the existing environment have to say about my security? Secondary is going to be the environment. Whereas on a top-down approach, that's where we start. A true bottom-up investment fund is characterized by significant tracking error as a result of assuming considerable active risk, where we have defined this active risk as holding securities that are actively managed in the portfolio, where your proportions of the security weightages are different from that in the benchmark index. I mean, that is a necessity, right? If you're trying to make higher returns than the benchmark, you will have to do something which is different than the benchmark. If not all, the only return that you're going to make is that of the benchmark. We look at the different investment styles that we can come across. You can have a value-based strategy, where the premise is that rigorous analysis will be able to identify whose value is greater than the price placed on by the market. And often by buying and holding these securities on a long-term basis, a higher return can be achieved than the market. For example, a PE-based approach, right? Managers of equity income or income and growth, which we have seen, often adopt this value-oriented style, where out-of-fashion stocks, which can have high dividend yields or which have an option to turn around, can really generate return for them. Then you have a growth at a reasonable price strategy, where the strategy is based on identifying long-term sustainable advantage-driven companies, right? In terms of the business franchise, the quality of management, technological factors, etc. You're trying to see where, from a growth perspective, can you make money, not from a value perspective per se. Then you have the momentum trades, which are going to be based on trends. And you can take contrarian approaches as well. I believe we spoke about Warren Buffett here as well, where the market is selling, but you're a buyer. The market is a buyer, but you're a seller. A completely contrarian investment approach. Active investment in particular will involve certain investment styles, which will focus on, for example, growth, which is an aggressive investment style, growth at a reasonable price, which is less aggressive. And we define these strategies across as well. We looked at value investing in particular, where we are trying to identify established companies, which can be cyclical in nature. The market has priced them lower right now, but when the cycle comes up to its peak and the market reprices it efficiently, that's where you get your return. The focus is on mean reversion. Right now it is priced lower, but you know the market has in the past priced it at a higher multiple. Eventually, when that mispricing or inefficiency is corrected, you are going to make money. We spoke about the PE-based valuations here and how it is used as a value investing approach. Income investing, where the focus is on a current income basis. High dividend yielding companies are a key focus across over here. And there is an approach where quantitative models, mathematical models, regression, simulation, BI tools, etc., that can be used to identify stocks as well. We distinguish between absolute return, centralized versus decentralized investments, how these strategies can be combined together, where you have a co-satellite approach, the approach, and then the small approach through a satellite approach. And we looked at an example, core of your portfolio, 80%, for example, is going to be a passive portfolio. 20%, which is the satellite, is going to be a high risk approach, for example, an active investment approach, where the high return is targeted, albeit at, of course, a higher risk. We looked at the smart beta approach as well, where active and passive management are combined into products and delivered as structured products to meet specific investor goals. That can be the form of macroeconomic factors, it can take the form of style factors. These are the typical structured products that are embedded through the smart beta approach. Then we went on to the next section of investment management, where we brought in the role of asset classes and funds. Right now, we had extensively spoken about asset classes in the respective chapter, asset classes, but we started to see how all those characteristics, we can use them to see how we can fit most appropriately into our portfolios as well, because each of those characteristics, even in the respective chapter, we spoke about it, right? Cash, for example, high safety, major liquidity, relatively lower risk, absolutely limited growth opportunities, right? But very liquid, lower the risk, lower the return is what we looked at when it came to the respective asset class. Then we looked at bonds, fixed income instrument. Steady, you have a current income coming in on a certainty basis, right? You're exposed to an interest rate risk. There is a potential credit risk which can affect depending on who the issuer is like. Liquidity is relatively low depending on the tenor. So there are certain risks, the default risk, the interest rate risk, which can expose your asset class. But to compensate for that risk, the bonds will offer a relatively higher rate of return. Relative to cash, it will offer you a higher rate of return. We looked at the likes of properties after that. Some of the major characteristics there were the heterogeneity. Each property is unique. Pricing is going to be a problem. Legal aspects are important. Quantum of investing can be a major consideration. Liquidity is extremely low. To compensate for all of this, the relative return is much higher. Then we went into stocks, shares, derivatives, and even commodities thereafter. Here, it does have liquidity, major growth potential, but at the same time, massive risk on a relative basis. But how did we classify? How did we define this massive risk? Is that you have cash, unless it's purchasing power, your cash is going to remain cash. You have bonds, and unless there is some interest rate risk, the value is going to be largely maintained. You have property, most likely you're going to see an appreciation in the property in generic terms. Stocks, equity, you go and buy a share, you buy it at 100 rupees. A year down the line, it might be worth 1 rupee. You can wipe out your capital here, shares. Higher the risk, at the same time, very, very high the return as well. And we can integrate these asset classes to construct the risk profile that we desire. You might have a risk-averse investor, you might have a moderate risk-taking investor, and you can have a high-risk investor. You can diversify their portfolios, meet their risk objectives, and at the same time give a efficient level of return. Risk to reward ratio is good. How do you achieve that? Is by combining, by integrating, by structuring these portfolios, by understanding what are the characteristics of the asset classes and structuring them, considering the status, conditions, etc., requirements, objectives of the clients. Very important section there. You can see situations where you might be asked to select certain portfolios, or you might be given a portfolio and asked to select the risk tolerance of an investor. Either way, top down or bottoms up, either way, you can have potential questions coming your way. We looked at the role of cash in a portfolio very specifically. Low risk, low return helps you to reduce, or not reduce, it helps you to manage the volatility in your portfolio, right? Because the risk is so low. When you look at certain asset classes, the risk is high. What is the more common way of describing risk? Variance, dispersion. If you have 80% of your portfolios in equity, which can have large fluctuations, 20%, let's go and park it in cash where the risk is much lower. It will help you to manage that variance in your portfolio, how we use cash, right? Suited as a short-term investment, historically an underperforming asset class because lower the risk, lower the return. We look at the role of bonds in our in our portfolio as an asset class. Gives us a predictable, visible stream of cash flows. We know year on year we are going to, or semi-annually we are going to receive coupons. At the end of the tenor, you're going to have your capital repaid back. You have that security and guarantee, right? There are a range of yields, there are a range of tenors which can suit your whims and fancies as you like. Inflation can be a major contributor here because you're a fixed income earner, your purchasing power can come down. We particularly in a local context, this makes a lot of sense right now, right? If you're a fixed income earner and the way interest rates are behaving, although they should be increased, the way the cost of living is going up, gas is going up, vegetables and fruits have gone up, but you're earning only a fixed amount, right? That's where the issue comes. Inflation can affect the real return and value of your portfolio. Default risk, of course, as it applies to fixed income instruments, are going to be a consideration. Particularly, you will focus on the issuer. If it's a government or a related issuer, the related default risk is much lower. But if you're looking at a private or even an unlisted issuer, then your default risk is going to be much more higher. And we discuss some of the main risks which are attributable to fixed income securities, the likes of credit risk, market risk, unanticipated inflation, liquidity, exchange rate risk if it's an international issued one, call provisions being in there, seniority risk can be a consideration, all which we spend some time with in the theory sessions as well. We also looked at bond strategies, an extremely interesting area, which I hope you found it too. Yeah, you can, if you can recognize the characteristics of the cash flows, how much of coupons you're going to receive and what is the principal at the end of the period of the time. And if you can see what the characteristics of this stream of cash flows are like, you can start creating some fantastic strategies in there, right? Diversification, we recognize within bond strategies are also important to reduce risk. And this will, how do we diversify our exposure to bonds as an asset class? Look at different issuers. Particularly, we recognized as it applies to different issuers, the default risk is going to be a factor. Look at different types of bonds across governments, international agencies, corporate bonds, etc. Right? It will help you to diversify between specific sectors. Right? If one sector falls, the other sector is not going to be as exposed. And look for bonds with different maturities. Because interest rate risk in particular, duration as we like to call it, can have a major implication to the bonds price. And if you have across a range of maturities, it will help you to manage this exposure as well. We looked at the different strategies as it applies to bond strategies. We looked at a ladder ring strategy or an immunization strategy where you will buy securities with range of maturities, 3, 5, 7, etc. across the board, equal maturities you have across the boards, right? So you will balance between short-term securities and you will balance between long-term maturities. The short-term securities, if short-term interest rates change, there will be shifts in the prices, but it will ideally be set off with the stability of the long-term portfolios. If you see long-term interest rates changing, you will see some volatility in the long-term portion of the portfolio, but it will be set off by the stability in the short-term interest rate. Ultimately, your variance, your dispersion is going to be within a certain, laddered level. Sort of. We looked at barbell strategy where, barbell at the two ends, you have the big wheels or the plates, and you have a smaller bar in the middle, right? The holdings are going to be concentrated on the longer and short end of the spectrum. Medium term, not as much, right? Short term will give you stability. Long term will give you the yield, and you're trying to manage these exposures throughout. We looked at active bond strategies, and we looked at passive bond strategies, which are similar to the trading aspects which we discussed as well. And we also went into a quick discussion on bond funds as well, similar to the equity portion, as a result of having that intermediary who has a lot more bargaining power, higher quantum of money, access to professional investment advice, diversification benefits, etc. All these elements will come into the bond funds as well, similar to the collective investments, collective instruments, which we looked at in chapter 3 also. Bond selection. How do you go about selecting the bonds? What are going to be some of the key elements that you need to focus on? What is the investment objective? Right? Whether the investor is able to invest in certain sectors and secure issuers. What is the average maturity you're looking like? Are you looking at risk management, or are you purely looking at return? If you're looking at risk management, most likely you're trying to create a immunization strategy kind of, trying to match the cash flows off. Then you have to be very specific. If you're looking at a pure return strategy, maybe you might want to set it off against a particular expense or a forecast expense which you have. Duration, which has a major bearing on the price. Credit quality, a major implication to the selection criteria. Performance, fees, charges, fund managers, etc. All of this will contribute to selecting between the different bond strategies out there. It's similar to the equities. You have exchange traded funds here as well, which contribute. Then we went on to look at role of equities in a portfolio. And equities, when we were talking about asset classes, we had already established that equities are a high risk instrument, which you need to be careful about. And we just spoke about why particularly it is high risk, because of that factor that you can lose your investment even. The main risks that we can highlight in relation to equities is the fact that the price can change, which can on paper erode your entire capital. Liquidity risk, you might not be able to sell the security, and volatility risk, variables which affect the respective security can cause significant volatilities. We spoke about equity funds under collective investments as well, and the benefits that you will receive, how to select between different funds. We spoke about fund ratings. We spoke about helps us to identify in relation to ratings how the respective funds are performing. We looked at a few Lipper and Morningstar, etc. We looked at the respective institutions and what they look into. We looked at the fund fact sheets as well. We evaluate the fund's characteristics and whether it's appropriate for a client's portfolio. Don't forget, under fiduciary responsibilities, we constantly spoke about suitability. Just because a fund is performing good, well, above average or outperforming, we don't go and take that fund and plug into our investors' portfolio. We need to look at the characteristics of the fund and recognize whether it's suitable for our client as well. Objective, profile, asset allocation, turnover, fees, charges, etc., risk, all of these correlation we need to consider before including in our clients' portfolios. Okay. Can have fund manager ratings also. We looked at managers are also important when it comes to a collective instruments, right? Because more often than not, one major factor contributing to those funds performing is the fact that the fund manager, the respective fund manager, drove the performance as well. And for example, I think the illustration we looked at is you have an amazingly performing fund in a particular organization and you want to go and put your money in there, but you realize the respective fund manager is no longer there. the investment decisions and the strategies, etc., a large contribution is coming from that investment manager. And he's at a different institution now. Where would you prefer to put your money in? A or B? You'll have to put it into the new institution, right? We spoke about risk and return. I mean, we spoke about it many a time, and we looked at asset classes, value, growth, income oriented, etc. Based on those risk return characteristics. Again, we reiterated it over here. We looked at measuring risk. You saw this under the statistics section as well, where standard deviation and variance plays a major role. We looked at different risk return measures. Total return is an important consideration when you look at the likes of equities, for example. Not only do you have a dividend income, you also have a capital appreciation component there as well. So when you're evaluating return, you might or you should be taking into consideration this total return component out of the evaluation for the evaluation. From a funds perspective, the focus will be on alpha as well as beta. Beta is looking at the sensitivity of the security's return compared to the broader market. How sensitive is it? If the market moves by 1%, do you move by 2%? If the market moves by 1%, do you move by 1%? If the market moves by 1%, are you moving by 0.25%? You're trying to identify correlations, how sensitive you are. +1, 0, -1, or anything in between that. You're trying to identify those. Those have, although we didn't dive into that, those have important bearing on your portfolio structuring and diversification even. Alpha, essentially, we are looking at the incremental return, active return, right? And of course, that outperformance, that active return, alpha, is going to come at the expense of higher risk, which we discussed a moment ago as well. We looked at the decomposition of total return, return on riskless assets, return that the client would expect based on their level of risk, return from market timing and from stock selection, etc. We broke this down. We also recognize the importance of risk diversification. I mean, when it comes to equities, when it comes to financial planning, diversification is going to play a very, very important role. And constantly we kept talking about these aspects as well. We looked at what it means from a conservative investor's perspective, an adventurous investor's perspective, and we started building in the systematic, unsystematic risk to try and identify how all of those came together. In addition to performance appraisal, we need to be able to attribute performance as well, which is where this performance measurement also comes into place. Not only are we trying to measure the performance, we are trying to identify why this performance was achieved. Okay, great. The portfolio manager achieved 10% return, but what if the benchmark has achieved 20% return? What happened here? Was it his decision on asset allocation that caused the detrimental effect? Was it his decision on stock selection that caused the detrimental effect? What were the causation factors for the performance? Was it purely chance? Or was it actually because of the portfolio manager's decisions, right? How do we go about this? Benchmarks, just as we spoke about this, right? Either you will have a client's benchmark, you will have a comparable universe of funds, or you will have a custom benchmark depending on the investment style or strategy that you're using. You have to find an appropriate benchmark. Because if you're a value strategy oriented manager and you're benchmarking against a growth investment style, you've got a problem. That's not going to explain anything. If you've got a long-term passive portfolio versus a short-term trading portfolio and you're using these to benchmark, it's not going to give you any explanation. You need to find like with like. You might find a trading portfolio from a value perspective. You might find a growth-oriented active investor or a growth-oriented passive investor. You need to find the appropriate benchmark. Very important. You can have, we looked at the different tools, we looked at the different types of indices, price weighted, market value weighted, etc. We looked at the GIP standards as well, Global Investment Performance Standards of the CFA Institute, and particularly we looked at the holding period yield, the money weighted return, and the time weighted return. Total return was a major focus across over here because you cannot discount one at the expense of the other. You can't only look at capital appreciation, doesn't give you the full picture. You can't only look at current income, doesn't give you the full picture. You need to look at it from a total return aspect. We looked at how the calculation works for money weighted return and time weighted return, although the curriculum doesn't go there, but you need to know the process only. Then came the important aspect here, performance attribution itself. What made your portfolio as the fund manager perform the way it did? Was it because of your asset allocation decision? Was it because of your sector choice? Or was it because of your security selection? Because if you, as the fund manager, replicated the benchmark in its entirety, all you would have earned is the benchmark return. That's it. Benchmark gave 12%, you achieved 12%. That's it. Why did your portfolio give 20% when the benchmark gave only 12%? Is because you decided to deviate from the asset allocation of the benchmark. You decided to deviate from the sector selection of the benchmark, which performed better. You decided to deviate from the security selection from the benchmark. Benchmark had a particular sector, which you also selected. So there are no deviation. Technically, we should generate the same return. But sector performed negatively. And the benchmark portfolio dropped 10% as a result of the sector selection decision. But my portfolio, as a result of the sector selection decision, only dropped 5%. Why was that? Same sectors, but mine didn't drop as much. In fact, I had a better performance, -5 versus -10. Why did my portfolio perform better than the benchmark? Security selection. Within the sector, I chose, for example, defensive stocks versus within the sector, the benchmark chose high beta stocks where they were more sensitive to the market. Benchmark portfolio dropped 10%. My portfolio only dropped 5%. That is because of my decision as the fund manager to select defensive stocks in the sector versus sensitive stock in the benchmark. Now we are attributing that performance to the fund manager's decision. Good think of that, right? This was a very important slide, which you can always go back to the recorded session to see. We looked at a very comprehensive illustration in terms of trying to identify those very variables that we were speaking about, why the portfolio performed the way it did. In absolute terms, you had a loss. Both the benchmark portfolio and the portfolio in concern. But there were outperformances in relation to certain aspects. There was underperformance, as you can see, due to asset allocation. There was outperformance, which we attributed to security selection, which is why at the end of the day, our portfolio was better or worse off than the benchmark portfolio. We also looked at different performance ratios as well. The Sharpe ratio, the Sortino ratio, the Traynor ratio. We looked at maximum drawdowns, etc., which are not complicated ratios to actually go through. Done. Which brought us to the end of investment management, right? Let's jump into our questions. Right, investment management. Let's look at a few sample questions. Which of the following terms best describes an investment policy that aims to track the movement of an index? Easy question, guys. See, if you can recap, just as we did, right? I took you through all the slides, the key components I took you through. And very important that you spend time with the curriculum as well and spend time with the question bank. It makes life a lot less difficult at the exam, without a doubt. Because, for example, if you see this question, if you have the same level of familiarity, if you were paying attention to the recaps as well, this would be an easy answer, wouldn't it, guys? Thoughts, anyone? How you would describe a investment policy that aims to track the movement of an index? Is it related to growth investing, value investing, thematic investment, or a passive investment? We established when it comes to tracking a particular index, this is our discussion at the very onset itself, we are talking about a passive investment, right? Seen in collective investment funds, for example, which are described as index tracking funds, right? If you are paying attention to the revision also, that the summary rather, you would have found it a easy question. The return to a portfolio in question number 2 asks us, co-varies exactly with the return of the market. If the beta is 1, if the beta is -1, expected returns for both are the same. Return on the market is lower and return on the market is high. See, we discussed this, right? When it came to beta, the +1, the -1, the 0, we discussed it entirely in an application-oriented context, right? But the question, if you might notice, is trying to throw you off the track. Portfolio covariance with the return of the market, la-di-da. Essentially, return of the portfolio and how does it move with the market? What are we talking about? Expected return for the portfolio versus the market is the same. Market moves by 1%, portfolio moves by 1%. Expected return percentages are the same. This is what you need to prepare for. What do we have over here? Okay, we have a capital asset price model calculation. Again, if you, all you have to do is to apply the formula. And we do know when it comes to the capital asset pricing model, we are talking about the risk-free rate plus the beta factor into market return minus the risk-free rate, right? This is what we establish as the risk premium, which we will have to offer up and above the risk-free rate to attract investors to put their money in our equity. We are told the current risk-free rate is 3% and the market return is 9% minus the risk-free rate again, which we have already put down, with a beta of 0.8. 6. Let's see what the answer is like. The answer is 3% plus the beta factor of 0.8% into the premium of 9 over 3% gives you a value of 7.8%. Your answer is B. This I would have classified as an easy question. Next question. As a portfolio becomes increasingly well diversified, which of the following factors will be driven towards zero? If you remember the illustration on how total risk came down as the number of securities in a particular portfolio increased. But this will only happen up to a particular level. You see, this risk is coming down, but you see a proportion of the risk unchanged. As a portfolio becomes increasingly well diversified, which of the following will be driven towards zero? Total risk, systematic risk, unsystematic risk, or none of the above. We have already established that diversification will help you to reduce what? The unsystematic risk component. No matter what industry you go and put your monies in, assuming to diversify, unsystematic risk, yes, but all the industries are going to be exposed to interest rate, inflation, unemployment, whatever, exchange rates, all the industries are going to be affected from it. So the Systematic component you can't do much about. Unsystematic component, on the other hand, we can diversify, we can reduce towards zero through diversification. Question number 5, an investment is set up to meet a future liability. Okay, kind of like an immunizing approach, set up to meet a future liability. Remember, for example, you make $1,000 investment today where you will receive $50 for each of the next 5 years plus the return on the principal across years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is going to be your inflow. Right? Let's say you have a liability which has the exact reciprocal cash flow requirements, for example, right? That's how we have set it up, the investment, to meet the respective liability, right? Immunization, essentially. The risk that the income from the bonds is invested at a interest rate lower than the interest rate at the start of the fund is called what? Another, I think for you guys, is going to be an easy answer. It's going to be the reinvestment rate that we are talking about. That is one of the assumptions as well. That whatever the returns that you can get, you can reinvest it back at the same rate. If you can't, it exposes you to the basis risk, which again is beyond our curriculum. What is the aim of portfolio diversification? Seems like an easy question, isn't it? Portfolio diversification. Optimize risk return trade-off or risk reward trade-off. Reduce the risk to zero. I mean, this one is almost unheard of. Reduce returns at all times. Reduce returns at all times? Definitely not. To expose the portfolio to the maximum risk, obviously not the answer. Our answer is we are looking to optimize the risk reward trade-off. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We did talk about the diversification elements. Holding of an international equity has which added risk compared to a domestic equity? Credit, exchange rate, interest rate, or liquidity risk? The obvious answer is incremental one. Right? You will have credit risk, particularly if it's a bond. Here we are talking about an equity. You will have interest rate risk. You will have liquidity risk because it's a listed one. Exchange rate risk is particularly applicable for an international. Question number 8. What type of risk does a shareholder have if there is no one willing to buy shares that they now wish to sell? We discussed this today. We discussed this in the revision, right? The easy answer here, the answer is liquidity risk. You can't sell the security which you hold. See, it sounds like something which you are unfamiliar with, right? But we absolutely discussed this across. Returns to investments are usually calculated as, here this is a tricky question where total return is the focus. We want to calculate the total return, capital plus current income as compared to the total investment, change in the market price, capital appreciation, plus income received and reinvested divided by the market price at the start of the period. Total return calculation answer is question number 10. Which type of investment is likely to be most suitable for a client who is seeking current income and whose attitude to risk is classified as low risk? Now, most important factors for you to deciding here is going to be the current income aspect of it and the low risk aspect of it. Right? Commercial property, you're probably going to receive a current income, but it is most definitely not low risk. Government bonds, can we tick the boxes? Current income, yes. Low risk, most definitely yes. Let's look at the other answers. The hedge funds, most definitely not low risk. Current income can depend on the strategy. High yielding equities, why are these equities offering a higher yield? Because with the higher yield comes a higher risk. So definitely not low risk. On the other hand, government bonds, tick, both the boxes. So answer is B. One. So we have one more chapter to discuss before we are done with our revision session as well. But let's jump into that chapter. I think good time to take a break. We'll jump into lifetime financial provisions after a 20-minute break. Maybe quick have a cup of tea and come back to wrap up the last chapter as well as our program as well. Right. So if you've got any questions, guys, I can help you out with before we go into the break. Or if you feel free to put it up on the chat box as well. Do spend time with the curriculum, spend time with the slides. Particularly, I mean, the videos can be time consuming, but at this point of time, if you have any doubts, it's always good to go back to the videos. But the curriculum should easily sort you out. The slides should easily sort you out. Spend time with the question bank, absolutely critical. We are spending time here with the questions and the revision to quickly bring the stuff back into mind, refocus attention to some of the key elements in the content, as well as how to look at the different questions that can come your way. Right. So we'll break for now and I shall see you in 20 minutes.